So I want to talk about community. I've only got half an hour, so I've decided I'll just have to go very fast, if that's okay. Just to explore community. And I'm sort of very fortunate in a lot of my work because I get to work with many different types of communities. Some of them are very formal and visible, and some of them are slightly subversive and invisible. And quite often, those two communities are held in the same organisation. They're in the same physical space. They may even have the same people amongst them. Because the interesting thing, of course, is we're not just within one community, we're in many different communities, many different layers, serving many different purposes, with different types of power behind them, different modes of cohesion between them, doing different things. Communities are quite interesting because they can either be cohesive, meaning they're high functioning, they're able to get stuff done, or they're passive or incoherent, where they may be formally defined. We may say we have a community over here, but it doesn't really do anything, it doesn't achieve anything. So I want to explore a little bit about those different types of community, but start by thinking about where they are. Well, we kind of have two entities at play. One is the formal structure. Most of you probably exist within a formal structure, be it an academic or a medical one. A formal structure is an organisation, as we understand it, a legal entity, a building. It's a system of codified rules, frameworks, guidance, accreditations, machines, trolleys, wheels, all of that stuff's a formal system. Anything that an organisation can see and own and control is a formal system. Formal systems have a few common features. They're only ever one-dimensional. You can always draw the formal system. So you can draw the relationship between everybody in it, and you can map it out by looking at consequence. Who can apply consequence onto somebody else? Who can control somebody else? Now, you might have some dotted and curved lines, but broadly speaking, there's only ever one formal system. Within it and around it flows the social system. The social system is the network of relationships, bonds of pride, bonds of trust. And we're going to come back onto trust later, look at that aspect in more detail. And social systems are interesting. They're multi-layered, contextual. So we belong to some very formal communities that also map closely to social communities. They're very parallel. Communities of practice may be visible. Professional communities, certainly functional entities within an organisation. But we also belong to other networks, networks of friends, people we used to work with, networks of people that we can get together to complain about something, people that we can get together with to effect a difference, all these different communities. So the social structure is complex. We can never truly visualize it. In fact, in many ways, we tend to overestimate our power and effectiveness within it. Because in our social communities, we use a different type of power. It's a reputation-based authority. You can't carry your formal authority into a social community. Because if you do that, you just make it formal. If you try to apply your formal power in a social space, you breach the implicit rules of the social space. And I'll come back onto implicit rules again later as well. So the context of all of my work really is exploring aspects of the social age, and that's where I say we are. I think we're substantially through the digital age. Not that we're not about to see these incredible transformative effects of technology, because we can't really consider any aspect of contemporary life without looking at aspects of technology. We've seen in the news just last week the machine learning algorithms that can predict in certain contexts with more than 90% accuracy from a facial scan, whether you're heterosexual or homosexual. What's the significance of that? Technology allows us to do it. There are 79 countries in the world where homosexuality is illegal or not decriminalized. So potentially, technology has put in the hands of those regimes the ability to persecute people. Technology takes us to places that civil society doesn't know what to do with. And we're just beginning to touch the edges of that. So technology will continue to evolve, but the reason I say we're substantially through the digital age is because we felt two key transformative effects. The first is connectivity. We're connected in many different ways, almost all of which are entirely out of the oversight or control of any organisation. You can be connected in professional communities, and you can be connected in subversive communities. You can be connected in communities that are trying to bring down a system, while simultaneously being in a community within the system.
The social age is about that connectivity and about the democratizing effects of technology. So every device that you hold in your hand to consume, you can also produce with. You can take photos, you can curate stories, you can share stories. You can achieve reputation at scale. In fact, you can achieve effect. That phrase is quite interesting because historically, achieving effect at scale is something that only organizations could do, formal legal factories and train networks. But now, we can achieve effect at scale through our communities, through our connectivity. It's democratized. Things like Kickstarter and Pledge Music even democratize finance. Increasingly, technology will take control away from the old entities of power and put it into our hands, into the hands of our communities. It'll still leave us with the challenge of what we do with that, but we're seeing overall a rebalancing of power. So our ability to be high-functioning within communities sits at the heart of the social age, to understand what they are, where they are, how they're effective, how they operate, and probably how we can live with them. My own thinking has evolved to that space. Our challenge isn't particularly to make our formal organisations better, because whatever we feel about it, our formal organisations are generally already pretty good. What they entirely fail to do is recognise the social structure. So I work with many different organisations, from governments to militaries to pharmaceutical companies, engineering companies, and many of them, I strongly suspect, are highly effective, almost despite everything they do, to try to be effective. They're effective because of the tacit, tribally held knowledge that we've heard about today. They're effective because people want to do a good job. Research shows it quite clearly. If people trust the organisation, if they trust the organisation, they say they'll be generous. They say that they'll be likely to help others to succeed. They say they will share their knowledge if they trust the organisation. But 54% of people in the survey I did last year say they have low or no trust in the organisation they work for. So if we want communities, we might have to explore the conditions for community. That's what I want to look into today. Stories are interesting. Stories are mechanisms of the transmission of knowledge. We've heard again a little about knowledge a few times today. Knowledge is held within stories, different types of stories. We can sort of broadly think about 3 types of stories. Formal organisational stories. They're typically very glossy, high quality, and they're pushed out through systems. The messages that flow down from on high, from politicians, from leaders, they're glossy, they're beautiful. They're often deemed to be quite inauthentic. We have another type of story, which is the co-created story. Stories written by communities. Those types of stories can be very untidy. They can actually quite often be stories of dissent and difference. But they're typically deemed to be more authentic because we each have a say within them. And the third type of story is the individual story. We all have our own individual narrative. Individual narratives may be held privately or may be generously shared into our communities to help build those co-created stories. But individual narratives are very authentic because, bluntly, my story is my story, and you can't make it inauthentic. There's an interesting feature that we like authentic stories. I've just surveyed 2,500 people in Apple on the traits they look for in leadership. They identified 69 different traits, and the number 1 trait they identified was authenticity. But authenticity can be quite lacking within formal systems. In fact, it's probably in the nature of formal systems that they exert a form of organisational pollution onto us that robs us of our authenticity. But personal stories have inherently got high levels of that authenticity. So stories are fired at each other. Within the NHS, we see politicians firing stories. We see leaders firing stories, nurses firing stories, patients firing stories. We see people with lots of knowledge firing stories and people with no knowledge responding to those stories. Some of them have high levels of authenticity, some have low or no levels of authenticity. But understanding how stories work is essential to understanding how we can be effective, how we can build communities that are effective in that context of the social age. Because we live in the arms of our communities, of these different communities. We're often effective because of our communities. I've got a friend who's just started in a senior role at Lego, which is a great organisation. She's really excited to be there. It's her 5th job. She was interviewed by somebody that had been there for 15 years. And he said, where do you think you'll be at Lego in 10 years' time? And so she answered the question. She said, I told him what he wanted to hear. Oh, in 10 years' time, I'll be chasing after your job in Lego. What she actually thought was, 10 years' time, you're kidding. Lego will be a distant memory by then. Because we'll have many different jobs. The only things that will remain constant will be our communities, will be the people around us. There's another interesting thing. Within formal systems, we hear permitted voices, the voices that we're allowed to hear. But sometimes we need to hear the unheard voices, the voices that lack permission. Another interesting thing going on at Lego, there's lots of Lego in the Lego office. It's full of it. You get a huge discount in the shop, and you can use that discount for friends and family. So there's really very little barrier to the ownership of Lego. But she described an interesting feature, which is that recently Lego's been in trouble. You might see they've had some redundancies. And they've got a new model, which is the Disney Castle. I don't know if you've seen it. It might just be me that's a Lego geek in the room. I don't have the Disney Castle, but I am eyeing up the new Millennium Falcon. It's a big model of the Disney Castle, and it comes with a Mickey and Minnie figure. And Mickey and Minnie have been going missing from the castle in head office. And the response of head office, the formal authority, was to write to everybody to say, Mickey and Minnie are going missing. Stop stealing Mickey and Minnie. What do you think the response is of the community to that story? They're stealing more Mickey and Minnies. The attempts of the formal system to control behaviour through inauthentic stories in a time when nobody cares about Mickey and Minnie. They're not worth anything. They're not worth anything to you or me. They're not worth anything to Lego. They can make 1 billion of those things. But they are totems of power and control. In a time when people lose control, they claim it in other ways. It's a cultural type of graffiti. And quite often, many of the behaviours we see exhibited by individuals and communities are in response to inappropriate actions of formal systems that are unwilling to listen. I've just surveyed 36,000 people in an global engineering company on what they look for, again, in leaders. And in that instance, they feel their leaders are authentic, but they say they have a very low permission to respond to the stories that are told. So it's not that they don't want to hear the views of leaders. They want to be able to respond to them. If they can't respond in formal spaces, they'll respond in subversive, hidden communities. But the interesting thing is, whether it wants to or not, our formal organisations probably will benefit from hearing those unheard voices, because the tacit tribal knowledge of an organisation is often where its effectiveness truly sits. People are left voiceless within a system for all sorts of reasons. You can be left voiceless because of your age. You can be left voiceless because of your gender. You can be left voiceless because you simply don't understand the implicit, hidden power structures of the system. There's not that much research on how long it takes to become culturally immersed, but broadly, what I'm trying to look at is 2 different effects. You have one of primary cultural alignment. How quickly do you align to your local culture? It's probably very fast, remarkably fast. In the first few hours and days of being within a new community, you learn who sits next to you, you learn whether they tidy their desk or not, you learn whether they walk around the office on their phone talking loudly. You are dominated by primary cultural alignment that's local very fast. But it might take, certainly in the interviews I've carried out so far, over 2 years to become immersed, to truly feel that you understand and can express the flows of power that are hidden within those tribal structures. It's very hard. There's quite an interesting thing. If you interview in different organisations about how people achieve that broad cultural alignment, they describe broadly similar paths. I've interviewed in 2 different graffiti gangs that talk about structures of induction, of learning rules, of understanding power structures, of learning who's in charge, of learning who can apply consequence on somebody else. And I've interviewed in the biggest technology companies in the world, and with groups of special forces soldiers, and with a group of adult porn stars in the US. And they say the same types of things. They say it's hard to get into the community. When they're in the community, they look out for each other. Some of those communities, interestingly, adult entertainment workers and special forces soldiers, exhibit signs of gated communities. Because whilst there's a slim chance I could become a graffiti artist, I'm never going to become one of those other things. Gated cultures have remarkably high barriers to entry, but once you're inside them, they can often exhibit strongly supportive, empathic, nurturing behaviours. The barrier is getting in, but once you're inside, the rules are very clear. Other types of cultures exhibit different types of rules, where you can get in at a low level, but it becomes very high to move up. That's quite interesting. In the trust research, it shows quite clearly at the moment, I've got a strengthening effect that trust flows outwards. It doesn't flow up and down. So there may be something endemic about trust that holds us in our place within a system. Been looking at the types of power that flow through communities, and this was an interesting thing in the workshop, the fun workshop we did earlier, which we may come back to later, I guess, and looking at the types of power. And broadly, we each have an individual power. It's held in strong social ties and personal reputation. Individual power is very strong, but it's limited in its reach. Hierarchy is a traditional historic mechanism for scaling power. If you put somebody within a hierarchy, they can control other people, and you can scale that infinitely. Social structures don't scale the same way as formal structures. I've been looking at complex global organizations and considering them in terms of radical complexity, because as organizations get big, their formal structure scales in a predictable linear way, but the social structure becomes radically complex fast. Because in large social structures, trust is held in tightly coherent, those hidden strong tribal units. But they don't become really big. They're always held small. So you have hierarchical power, but you also have this networked type of power. And networked power is really interesting because whilst formal power can be disrupted, our attempts to disrupt networked power typically reinforce it. So we see people who are oppressed by the system gaining strong reputational authority. Julian Assange would be an example, one man able to hold the American government to account. Islamic State is another example. You know, the Western governments are living in fear. In fact, they're actively promoting a fear of terrorism. But Islamic State as an organization only has somewhere between 10 and 30,000 people who have a name badge and an employment number. We don't think of it like an organization because we buy into the language of terror. But actually, it's just a collection of people. What it happens to be is an extremely innovative organization. And it happens to have a power base that's almost entirely networked. It's being countered by military structures which are made up of extremely expensive stuff. So whilst Islamic State is able to innovate through its highly dynamic community, a series of different roadside bombs, the military takes 10 years to take new armor from a concept through to application on the battlefield. So we're being outcompeted by highly innovative, networked organizations. There's also an interesting thing about consensus versus oppositional power. Oppositional power is easier to deploy. We don't like what we see at the moment, we should change it. Donald Trump is in power because of oppositional power. Typically, when people move into a position of authority, they switch to a consensus-based model of power. Because when you're in power, you have to do something about it. So it's easier to build a broad base of oppositional power than it is to build a focused base of consensual power. So when we look at conditions for community and how we make communities effective, we might need to think in terms of these languages as well. What's our individual power? Do we need any kind of hierarchy or structure of power? Can we be effective without one at all? And there are some organizations which explicitly avoid or forbid there to be formal structures. And do we need to build our networked and reputation-based authority? These are 16 conditions for community. I hope there's 16 on there. I forgot to count it before I put it up there. I'm not going to risk my mental arithmetic now. 16 conditions for community that I'm exploring. High social capital. My last book is about social leadership, reputation-based authority, and if you're interested in that work, I'll happily share I don't have copies with me today, but if you get in touch, I'll happily send you a copy of it, Exploring High Social Capital, your ability to understand these networks and thrive within them. Democratized spaces are important. People want a space, but they also want control of the space. People trust formal technology about 30% less than they trust social technology, even if it's the same technology. If it's owned by an organisation, if the work gives them a phone and work owns the phone, and they have an identical phone they own themselves, they trust their own phone more. If they only have one phone, but it has a work email account and a personal email account, they trust their personal email account more than they trust the work one. And interestingly, if the organisation breaches that trust, they don't treat it in a logical way. They treat it like betrayal. Betrayal by formal organisations to individuals leave people significantly less happy than they were to begin with. It doesn't just knock them down to a baseline state. Exploring the failure of trust is very interesting. So a whole series of pieces here. I'm not going to go into all of these, because I have to keep half an eye on the time. If I knew when I started, I'd know when I'm supposed to finish, but I'm probably good for 5 or 10 more minutes. I want to talk to you about one aspect of it that I've been exploring. This is to share some new research. Now, you're the first group of researchers I've shared it amongst, so I'm nervous. It's not the best research in the world. It's not the worst research in the world. But I adhere to a model of working out loud, of sharing your work as you go. So if you don't like it, perhaps you can help me make it better. The Landscape of Trust is the largest research project in the world this year looking at trust. It builds out of a prototype study last year, an open study with 5,000 people in it. It looks explicitly at 3 things: the nature of trust between individuals, the nature of trust within communities and teams, and the nature of trust in organisations themselves, and how trust flows between those different spaces. And then it looks at 12 different aspects of trust. So, for example, gender is one aspect of trust, and I'm going to share some very early stage results with you here. And the results I'm going to share with you, we can pick a lot of holes in. So I'm trusting you to let me share them and just see, because I find it fascinating, so I want to share the early work with you. We see interesting cultural differences in trust. It's too early to share some meaningful results of that, but to give an example, it's based on gathering stories. The whole trust research is based on gathering stories and carrying out critical discourse analysis of those stories. But just by reading the stories, I get accounts from China that say, you could live here for 30 years and I would never trust you in the same way I trust somebody else, because we don't have a blood tie. You get some people who say trust is only ever held between people, and yet you all trust the seats that you're sitting on. You trust the beams holding up the roof. We trust our cars. There are some trends that emerge. Overwhelmingly, people use analytical language when trying to explain what trust means to them. When they write their 100-word stories of trust building, trust failing, how trust flows, the currency of trust, they use overwhelmingly analytical language, very low levels of confident language. What does that mean? Maybe it means analytical people take part in trust research. More women than men take part in the research. What does that mean? Who knows? Maybe men and women do think about trust differently, but maybe that's a culturally defined feature. We know that there are many gender stereotypes that are effectively culturally defined, so maybe that's why. This year I'm gathering 1,000 open narrative accounts. I'm going to share a couple of figures from the first 178 that we've just finished analysing. Signing up 30 research partners, this is the mechanism to scale. I've got the Canadian federal government are just putting part of the survey out to 70,000 federal employees. I've got groups in the military and the fire service and the NHS. I've got a group of Muslims in Saudi Arabia, a group of Quakers in the UK. I need more research partners. We have got the Collab Out Loud community with Claire Hay, who are leading a research partnership group up here. Stuart's very supportive. I know that we can build a group out here, but if anybody's interested to take part, please do. It's our mechanism to scale. Building an explorer community, people who are interested in this. Let me share some results. It's early, so I'm finding my narrative about it. One thing that's clear is that when people describe the failure of trust, and remember that coherent communities need to have trust, when they describe the failure, they talk about the breaching of implicit rules. So they say, I shared a secret with you, and you told this person, and now I don't trust you anymore. In fact, I trust you significantly less than when I just didn't really have a strong opinion about you. And that's interesting, because it wasn't contracted. We didn't make it clear, it was unspoken. I've just started some work looking at the projection of trust. I suspect that quite often when people feel the failure of trust, it's not an active act by the other person that breaches it. It's a fracturing of their projected frame of trust onto the other individual. If we can find frameworks to represent how trust flows in these communities, we can work on how to build them. Because the interesting thing is, if we want to affect change, if we truly want to affect change, our challenge might not be to build a coherent community. Our challenge might be to engage in communities of difference, communities that we actively disagree with. To do that will require a humility and an understanding of how trust is earned through difference. And that's a much harder thing to do. Don't read too much into this. This is an analysis of the first 178 narratives of what trust means to me and how trust fails. The interesting things, there's a few interesting things. I've said there's this overwhelming analytical language used. The language of fear and disgust is extremely low in examples of what trust means, but also in stories about the failure of trust. In fact, the strongest language, even in stories of the failure of trust, is joy, language of joy, which seems perverse. It might be just a cognitive feature where in the moment we feel betrayed and then we rationalize it and say it made me stronger. So it might be that people look back on the failure of trust as a joyful experience. They don't say necessarily joy, but words around joy. I'll show what some of those are. And that's interesting because joy is almost equal across men and women. Now, the sort of thing which is obviously standing out there quite obviously is this point here. In 60% of narratives around trust, women use words of anger. Men use words in 15%. And that effect is strengthening. It continues to strengthen as the sample size grows. There are, of course, many reasons why that might be the case. I can tell you for a fact that there were more women than men taking part, but this doesn't tie directly into that. Doesn't correlate to age. In fact, interestingly, age so far shows no effect on any of the things that we're looking at in trust. But I'm not yet able to interview in children. I'm trying to get that in place at the moment with some ethical oversight to let us do it. So it might be, in fact, I would hypothesize that the nature of trust itself is changing. I think that the pervasive impacts of technology and the anonymous nature of technology and the evolution of privacy will probably fundamentally affect our social view of trust. But we'll see how that turns out. I wanted to share one interpretation of this. And when I say an interpretation, I mean a personal story. So I'm no longer talking about data. I'm talking about the subjective notion of trust. Because what's clear is that trust is subjective. So I know what trust is, and I'm highly trustworthy. You all know what trust is, and I'm not so sure about you, because I don't know you. Some of you I trust, because I know. It looks like I'm also willing to trust people at a second degree of connection. Where I've been able to interview in some quite difficult situations, I've been able to show that people are willing, under extreme conditions, to assemble groups of people to support them. And they primarily assemble groups of people that they trust, but they're willing to bring in people at a second degree of trust. And if that person, who I assume has a frame of trust projected on them, adheres to the rules, the implicit rules of the frame, it's validated and they become trusted. If the trust is breached, they trust everybody less. It's very interesting. The failure of trust is an active force. It's not a passive one. So I've started looking at trust like this. It's a basket of forces. It means something different to all of us. We all hold different things within that basket. And when we're forced to, we take a screenshot of it. We take a photo. We say, at this moment, I trust you. But interestingly, it seems quite clear again from the narratives, and I guess it makes sense, that we hold multiple concurrent versions of the truth. So I trust you right now in this context, but in another context right now I might trust you less. And in a different context I might not trust you at all, and somehow I'm able to rationalize all those things. So I realize I'm right down here in the rabbit hole. But trust is clearly one of the dominant forces that affects communities. I mean coherent communities. Not just a gang of people we throw together. In fact, a group of people we throw together wouldn't even be a gang, because it turns out that gangs have very strong power structures within them, based upon trust, and the application of consequence. I don't have time to get into consequence today. But I am looking at this. If you have high trust on a scale down to no trust, you probably have another force at play. I suspect that trust is a strong and active force and mistrust is another strong and active force. It's probably true that when we look round and look at an organisation, and forgive me for picking an organisation like the NHS, we may say it doesn't have high trust. Certainly it doesn't have it uniformly. It does have it held in tightly coherent, localised groups. What we probably see is organisations that have plenty of trust in them. They're awash with trust. It's a natural feature of human systems to accrete trust. But they also have high levels of mistrust. And if you have high trust and high mistrust, you probably have a functional culture. And the functional culture is one where you think you'll get paid at the end of the month. Nobody's going to try and actively poison you. You kind of trust it within the structure of the rules, but you probably don't trust it much further. If you want the good stuff, you need an invested culture, where people are willing to put their engagement in. To do that, we might actually just need to minimize mistrust. Forgive the plug, Stuart, but as you're hosting the event and kindly supporting it, I felt it was okay. Up in Manchester doing an open session soon, run open sessions as frequently as I can abuse the hospitality of my friends up here. We'll continue to explore and share the evolving research around this. In this next open session, we'll also explore some aspects around consequence, which I've been looking at. But I'm going to jump back just to the conditions for community slide to finish off. I think that many organisations believe that they can get value from accessing the tacit tribal knowledge, social learning approaches. They understand that the good stuff sits within communities. But quite often their mechanism to unlock that is technology. But it turns out technology is almost the very least of our problems. We need to consider the social skills of individuals, we need to understand the application of consequence, and we certainly need to understand how trust impacts on engagement within communities. Indeed, what it probably means at the highest level is that we have to consider fairness and kindness, the fairness of the organisation. There was a time when fairness would have been seen as a soft skill, as something that you have after you have all the hard stuff in place. You balance your budget and then you can be fair. I strongly suspect that in the context of the social age, it's organisations that are fair, that are transparent, and leaders who are humble within it, who will be most likely to succeed. Thank you.